The third component that we suggest has to deal with the SWOT analysis, and I think this is especially important from the drought readiness perspective. In other words, what are your strengths and weaknesses on your particular ranch or place with regards to drought? The other one, or number 4, also very important, is the inventory of your ranch resources. You know, just knowing what you've got in terms of the forage production potential, your livestock and grazing operation, and of course precipitation records associated with your particular location. Now the fifth one I think is certainly important, and a lot of people that have drought plans really focus on this one here. It's about critical or trigger dates. And really with this concept, it's just about monitoring precipitation amounts and looking at those uncertain or critical dates to estimate forage growth for that coming season. And when there are deficits, that is what triggers some type of management decision to try to bring things back into balance. And it's all really just based on that relationship, of course, between precipitation and what we see in terms of pasture production. And I've got the 2 top charts on here are from central Nebraska sandhills, just showing some long-term herbage production on the left with the green bars, and then on the right, in this case showing the May, June, and July precipitation. And you can see a fairly good relationship or correlation between that total 3-month period of rainfall and the annual herbage or grass production that we see on this type of sandhills rangeland. Now, of course, there are other very important factors that do need to be considered: the previous year's condition, the soil moisture status, the temperature, warm and cold. It was mentioned earlier how last year, how warm it was, how such an early spring that we did have. Carryover grass, too, is something very important. One of the things we saw in a lot of areas last year was because of those previous wet years in 2011 and 10, there was very good pasture production, and that really helped out a lot of ranchers last year in 2012. And then lastly, I'd like to give these climatologists some credit. You know, they're becoming much better at those longer-term forecasts, and I think as we go each successive month into the spring, that if we watch and follow some of those longer-term forecasts, we should be able to glean some information, if you will, that could certainly help us in some of our decisions regarding our stocking and drought plans. I've got just a quick example here of using some critical dates and an action flow plan. On the left, we've got a precipitation period or date. The middle column is a stocking rate impact. On the third column would be a management action selection. Now, again, these are just hypothetical, and that middle column, the stocking rate impact, some people might use something as similar to this rather than stocking rate. They might talk about pasture growth or pounds per acre, but I like to use just what it's doing, stocking rate. And then I also like to include the previous growing season. For example, well, 2012, we know it was a severe drought. We moved to the right. If it were average, then the impact, of course, is going to be none. Severe drought, we would follow this chain in the link. I'm suggesting here, again, just hypothetical, maybe a reduction of 15% because of the drought that occurred in 2012. And then we would go on to possible choices of management actions that we would have outlined in terms of what to do. Now, obviously, of course, with whatever management action is chosen, it should at least equal or exceed the reduction that we are anticipating in this case of stocking rate or grass growth or however you want to define it. Uh, Another example I've got here is showing a critical date of April 1st, the end of the dormant season, so the previous October through March. Where are we at that level? And then the subsequent steps would be, well, average, no action required, or say, and let's just say drought of some level, 60, 70%. And then subsequently having another reduction of 10, it could be 20 again. These are just hypothetical estimates, also followed by some other type of additional management action. An important thing to keep in mind that any of these reductions that we outline, they are cumulative. In other words, they're adding up as we progress through these different critical dates. Now also, in just one more example, I've given a case here where we may have multiple scenarios. So obviously in the terms of a plan, there can be more than one event or type of situation that comes place. So this one is somewhat set up like a decision tree, if you will. Again, we have the top line showing a date or precipitation period. And in the case of my example here, I'm using June 15th. I've got precipitation for the past 2 months, April 15th to June 15th. And I've got an example, an average for this particular location showing, well, if we're within 20% of that average, not a big deal. We wouldn't have no impact, and we would not need to implement any management actions, okay? We could have a case here where we may be a little bit drier than average, 1 to 2 inches drier than average, suggesting some type of reduction in stocking rate, and then you would fill in or decide which management actions you would need to mitigate that reduction in forage potential. So just a case here where there are really 3 or 4 different potential scenarios that might be developed as part of your drought management plan. A couple of the other components, very important, I think, the monitoring. You know, and of course, the weather, the precipitation. If we are relying heavily on these critical dates, knowing how much precip fell, it's going to be a very important part of this. Number 7, you should really develop, I think, a portfolio of different management strategies that you could use before, during, and after droughts. And these include things like on the grazing side, your different type of grazing rotations that you might use, the animal management side of things like the early weaning, supplementation. Outline all of those strategies that you might be able to use. Alternative forages is another one. If you have some cropland that you could devote to growing forages. All very important parts of this as well. And with that, those different management strategies, that portfolio that you develop or outline, again, you really do need to know how much forage savings or gain that you are getting as you implement or put into action each one of these. And I mentioned this before, that whatever action you use, that savings must equal or if not exceed the anticipated deficits due to drought. The last one, and I think also very important, just the need for ongoing review of the drought plan. It's a learning process, and I think this statement right here is very important. It seems that every drought is somewhat different. I mean, it's a complex situation. We have all of these different interactions going on, you know, related to the timing and the amount of precipitation, which part of the growing season that precip falls in, or when it's very dry. So it can make the resulting impact or longer term effects of the drought a little bit difficult to interpret. So each year, especially each year that you do go through a drought, keeping good records and observations can certainly help you modify that plan, and like I say, really it's a continual learning process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to